The first set of photos was the worst. It was just before Christmas, the season's snow only beginning to encroach onto the street. I had just finished speaking to my husband John on the phone, a high-profile murder, having taken him to Tulsa for a few weeks, or so he claimed. The case before had stretched from a few days to over a month.
"I can't talk about it,"
he had said as always. I suppose I should have been used to it. He had been the LAPD's chief homicide detective for a better part of 5 years. But there was still something about his voice on the phone after that day in the field. I could tell he had seen something unspeakable, and it put me on edge. The light was beginning to fade when I stepped from the porch and walked down the path to our mailbox. It was particularly full that night, the stack of bills and flyers spilling from my hands as I carried them to my kitchen table. Junk, junk, bill, junk, as always. That was until I came to the red envelope. The first thing that struck me was its starkness. It was unaddressed and unstamped, a bare bright envelope, 6x4. There was something unnerving about its very presence, and I considered waiting for John, who was supposed to return later that week. What if it was important? I couldn't hide behind John whenever the slightest thing was amiss. Stop being silly, I told myself. You're perfectly capable of handling the mail. I tore open the envelope. Inside was a stack of photos, 5 in all. Affixed to the first was a yellow post-it note, simply inscribed, "Spot the difference." I turned to the first photo. It appeared to have been taken on a mountain, the snow pure and undisturbed, settled over the trees in great white heaps. Strange. The next photo was almost the same. Perhaps the camera was shifted 30 degrees to the right, but all I could see was more snow. I checked the rest, but they followed the same pattern: blue sky, bare trees, and fresh snow. A prank. It had to be. I tossed them aside and went back to the kitchen. It was time to make dinner. Later that night, I lay in bed wide awake. Something was fleeting around the edge of my mind, a nagging feeling of insecurity. I was sure it was about the photos. Why would someone put them there? Was it just a kid, or did they actually know me? Then there was the message. Spot the difference. They were all the same, weren't they? I thought back to my childhood puzzle books. I had always been a fan of Spot the Difference. I would pore over them for hours, comparing the colors of hats and scarves, and minutely examining every tiny figure in the background. It hit me that those puzzles had required close inspection, not just a glance I had passed over the photos before casting them away. I stood up, feeling sick without entirely knowing why. The photos were as I left them, atop the stack of papers which had lately become a permanent fixture of my kitchen bench. Carrying them to the dining room table, I sat and began to re-examine each in turn. There was nothing different. Snow, snow, and more snow. Sure, the camera was rotating each time, but the position of the photographer never changed. The frame of each photo was filled with a crisp glow of recent snowfall. Almost ready to admit that I was reading too much into what was now obviously a prank, I scanned one more time. The old puzzles sometimes used a mean trick, I remembered. The human eye is drawn to the center of the picture. If the puzzle maker hides a detail right on the edge, it becomes almost impossible to find. It was then that I saw it, barely touching the left edge of the third photo. It was as plain as day, a streak of dark red blood staining the snow. I didn't sleep at all that night, or the next. John had been incredibly supportive. He marked the photos for immediate investigation and flew home in the early hours of the morning to be by my side. "It's okay, Karen. You're safe now. he said when I opened the door. The police believed that John was the intended recipient. Why else would we have received the envelope? It was probably the work of some sick individual who got off on taunting the police, they reasoned.
There's some really sad people in the world,
John likes to remark,
and it's our job to make sure they're put away for good.
Christmas came and went, the holiday season bringing with it family, friends, and endless lunches. And by the beginning of January, I had almost forgotten the photos. I was at work when I got the call, working at the computer in my cubicle.
Honey, you need to come home right away.
It was John, and he sounded dead serious. Waiting for me in the driveway were 2 squad cars, and with a feeling of apprehension in my chest, I entered the kitchen to find John and another detective seated at the table, drinking instant coffee. "What's going on, John?" He just nodded, down towards the center of the table, and my heart lurched as I noticed the bright red envelope. My hands began to shake as I sat down next to my husband. I reached for it, but his hand grabbed mine and held it tight.
"I'm with you, honey. It's going to be okay."
Then he turned the envelope over. Printed on it, in large black letters, was a single word: Karen. The set was of a Ferris wheel on a pier someplace sunnier. Later on, the police would identify it as Santa Monica Pier. All 5 photos were framed exactly the same, the spinning wheel froze in time against the bustle of the pier and the backdrop of the setting sun. "What's the difference?" I asked nervously. I didn't really want to know. "We've been on it for a while," the man next to John said, "and so far we've only been able to find one part of departure. In the 5th photo, the girl in the red dress vanishes from her seat on the wheel. They found her body a few days later, underneath the pier. There was a long slash wound down her chest, and the telltale signs of manual strangulation around her neck. Why me?" I sobbed. After we heard the news, John held me in his arms.
"We don't know yet, but we're working on it. You just have to trust me."
I don't feel safe anymore. This is my own home."
"I know, Karen. I know."
It was another 2 months before the 3rd letter arrived. Every night had been difficult for me. I was plagued by nightmares of the image of that girl in the red dress, struggling against her rough hands. She would call to me for help, but I was rooted to the spot, powerless. John wouldn't let me see the new envelope.
"They're trying to scare you, Karen, probably to get at me."
From what I could get out of him, the 5 photos were even more similar than the previous sets. They were of a bare field, stunted from the chill of winter. Evidently, the photographer had used a tripod, as each was framed in exactly the same way. "What's the difference?" I pleaded with John.
"It doesn't matter."
"They're addressed to me. It matters."
"It will only scare you. I don't want you to go through any more pain.
Not knowing is worse."
"It's a body, in the distance. It appears in only one of the photos."
"Have you found it?" He pauses.
"Yes, it was a local farmer. His throat has been cut."
I cried for hours that night. How could this happen to me? I asked John to quit his position, but he couldn't.
"We can't let them win, Karen."
It was easy for him to say. He didn't have to live with the apprehension that greeted me every morning, the fear that today another bright red envelope would have my name on it. Just like that, the envelope stopped. The police leads ran cold. They couldn't tie anyone to the 2 bodies they had found, and never managed to identify the mountains in the first photos, which had now arrived by almost 2 years ago. We couldn't afford to move house, despite John's high salary. We were saddled with a mortgage and student loans. Every day, I was forced to walk to the same mailbox and retrieve the same mail, desperately hoping I wouldn't find another bright red envelope. Gradually, my life had begun to return to normalcy. That morning, my boss had called me into his office and handed me a promotion that brought it with a hefty pay raise. I sat on the edge of my seat all day, desperate to tell John, but due to the fact that I was struck with a recent broken iPhone, he would only be out of reach until I got home. I drove back to the edge of the limit, the needle pushing 70 the whole stretch along the highway. I couldn't wait to see his face when I revealed the news. I pulled into the driveway and parked next to the mailbox. Even the sudden pang of nerves that accompanied the sight couldn't put a dent in my enthusiasm, and I flicked through the flyers absent-mindedly as I walked up to the path. No red envelopes. I walked up to the door and reached for my keys. I smiled as I realized it was unlocked. John must have finished early, and being a Friday, he would be looking to relax. As I stepped through the threshold into the house, I decided that I would cook our favorite meal for dinner that night to celebrate the good news. Slipping into my typical Friday night routine, I kicked off my shoes, dropped my bag by the door, and headed to silence the beeping of the answering machine.
First unheard message sent yesterday at 7:15 p.m.
Hi Karen, just looking to catch up sometime. Give me a call back.
End of message. To delete this message, press 7.
It was my friend Josie.
Next message.
Karen, it's me. I'm on my way home. You need to get out of the house right now. The police are on the way. We received another envelope today. The photos are our living room.
The message ended abruptly. My heart dropped, and bile rose in my throat. Blood rushed to my head, and spinning wildly, I tilted to the side in shock, knocking the answering machine from the table.
Next message.
We've gone through all the photos. All of us have looked, and they can't find any difference. They're identical, but you still need to get out right now.
My vision was blurry, and I could hear a loud ringing in my ears. I had only gone into shock once before, when I fell off a horse in my childhood. The feeling of powerlessness was unmistakable. The constant beeping continued. I wanted to shut it up. Beginning to hyperventilate, I reached out and clawed at the answering machine. The last message was John again. He was distraught, his voice high and pleading, barely comprehensible. But despite the crackling recording, despite his frantic speech, I could clearly hear the words.
Next message.
Karen, there were only 4 photos.
From behind me. That's when I heard the click of a camera.